Hello, and welcome to Chapter 4 of the missionary story, Where the River Begins. Last time, Francis got some bad news. You remember that Mom's in the hospital with a nervous breakdown, and Dad and the two girls went to live with Graham, but not Francis. But then he did get the good news that he was able to go to the farm and live with the Glennies. Francis really liked it there at the farm. Even though he didn't understand everything they were saying about Jesus, he wanted to learn more about him. He wanted to know where this love that he felt there in the Glennie home, where did it come from? And so the first Sunday when they said they were all going off to church, Francis thought that was a good idea. He thought maybe there he'd learn more about Jesus. Well, Francis started out listening to what the preacher was saying, and he was trying to understand until the preacher said that the Bible sometimes calls Jesus a good shepherd, which that's true. But when Francis heard the word shepherd, of course he thought of sheep, and when he thought of sheep, he thought of the farm, and he thought about how much he liked it there, and he didn't listen to anything else that the preacher said. Francis especially liked being near the river. He liked to go down there whenever he could. You remember, he really wanted to find out, where did all this water come from? Where did the river begin? Francis had found ducks and swans there at the river. Sometimes he even threw rocks at the ducks and the swans. He thought that was fun. Francis also liked Chris and Martin, the boys, the Glennie boys there that lived there at the farm. Although he thought they were a little bit, I think Francis's word was lame, kind of boring. And Francis thought he knew more about life, and so he could teach Chris and Martin a few things, until one day he tried. And he started telling Chris and Martin all about that he belonged to a gang, and that they did all kinds of cool things, and they had all kinds of cool weapons, like knives and bombs and things, he said. But Chris and Martin, they knew better. They just went, what would you do with stuff like that? Francis said, we did too have that stuff. We did things like smashing phone booths and slashing holes in tires and blowing things up. Chris and Martin laughed at him and walked away. Francis was really disgusted. So he stomped off into the kitchen there at the farmhouse, and he sat down at the table, and Mrs. Glennie was in there. She was ironing. You know what that is? You plug in an iron, it gets hot, and she takes it across the clothes to try to get all the wrinkles out of them. She was working hard at that job. He sat down there at the table, and he looked up, and he saw there on the wall that sign, remember? That said, God is love. And he just blurted out, Mrs. Glennie, where is God? Mrs. Glennie turned off that iron, and she sat down beside Francis. That was an important question. She told him, she said, Francis, that is a good question. Because when you know the answer to that question, when you know God, and you come to love him and believe in him, Francis, he's like the source of a beautiful river. He's the place where true joy and love and goodness all flow from. Francis, listen carefully when we talk about Jesus. Listen when Mr. Glennie reads from the Bible. Learn all you can. Come to know him and love him, and you'll know his love and his goodness too. Francis wasn't sure he understood all that, but he was going to think about it. One day, a couple days later, Francis woke up before anyone else there in the Glennie farm, and he went down into the kitchen. He had a plan for that day. Now, he knew that Mr. Glennie had a plan for that day. In fact, everyone there in the family had been given a job that they were supposed to work on there at the farm that day. This was a work day. But Francis decided that he needed a day off. And so he had made the plan. He quietly got into the refrigerator, got out some leftovers, packed himself a little lunch, went out and jumped onto his bike, and his plan was he was going to follow the river. Now, not follow where the river was flowing to, but he wanted to follow where the river was coming from. And he thought just maybe he could find the place where the river began. And so Francis was on that bike and he was happily pedaling along until he came to a place where the path went one way and the river went another way. He knew he couldn't ride his bike any further, so he got off and he laid it there and kind of hid it among the rocks and tall grass and stuff. And he kept on going on foot now, and he was walking and walking a long ways, and the time was passing and it was getting hot and he was getting hungry. So he found a shady spot among some trees and he sat down and he ate his lunch, and he kept on going. And he walked and walked, and the ground was changing. Here was the river, he was still following where it was coming from, but on this side there were more hills and it was getting steeper. And suddenly Francis came to a place where it was almost like a mountainside, and rushing down that mountainside was a big stream. And Francis watched as the water that rushed down that mountainside flowed right into the river. And he thought, what? If I climb up this mountainside and I find out where this water's coming from, that could be where the river begins. And so up he went, climbing and making his way, and it was a hard climb, a hard path. And we finally got to the top. It all evened out on a big meadow, and there were sheep grazing, and there was a farmhouse back there. And by now, the stream that was rushing down had gotten a little bit smaller, and it began to get thinner, and he followed the stream across the meadow, and there it stopped. Actually, there it started. There was a spring of water coming up from the ground. And that spring of water had made the stream that had flowed down the mountainside into the river. Francis was so excited. He dropped to his knees. Oh, the water was clean and clear. And he cupped some up to look at it. And suddenly he heard behind him a voice saying, "So, where might you be from?" Francis got surprised and he looked up. And he saw an old shepherd, and the old man was smiling down at him. Oh, Francis was so excited. He said, "Is this where the river really begins, and do you own it?" The man kind of chuckled and he said, "Well, let me tell you the story." He said, "This is one of the places where the river begins. There are springs like this all around these parts. They all flow into streams and they all flow into the river. But," he said, "yes, I own this. My father owned it before me, this land. But when we found this spring years ago, it wasn't clean and clear like this. No, it was dirty, filled with mud and sticks and leaves. But my father and I worked and cleaned it all out, and the water came rushing up, made that beautiful stream that flows into the river." Oh, Francis was so excited, and he was listening to all this, and he spent a little time there talking with the old shepherd. But before long, he realized that if he was going to get back to the farm before nightfall, he needed to get going. So Francis thanked the man and headed back the way he had come, all the way back. He was tired when he got back to the farm. Nobody was outside. He went into the kitchen and sat down, and Kate and Mrs. Glennie were in the kitchen. And Kate looked at him and she said, "You lazy boy, how dare you run off and not do your job? How dare you not tell Mom and Dad where you're going and worry us all day?" And then she stormed out of the kitchen. "Careful, Kate," Mrs. Glennie said after her. "Careful what you say." Nobody else said anything more about it that night. The next morning they all woke up, and Francis knew that there was a plan for this day too. This was an exciting plan. This was the day they were all going to go to the cattle market. Oh, Mr. Glennie had told him all about it, and Francis couldn't wait to go. It was the place where farmers would come and they would buy and sell cattle, and there was special food and all kinds of fun things to do, almost like a fair. And Francis had really been looking forward to it. But that morning after breakfast, Mr. Glennie called Francis aside, and he said to him, "Francis, I am sorry to say this, but you will not be going to the cattle market with us today. You knew you had a job to do yesterday, but you didn't get it done. And so today you'll be staying home and doing that job, while the rest of us go to the market. And then he said, Frances, we would have enjoyed it so much more if you had gone with us. But you need to learn to obey. You need to learn to do the work you've been given. Frances was so disappointed, but he acted like he didn't care. So he just shrugged his shoulders and walked away. But he watched as Mr. and Mrs. Glennie and Chris and Martin went off in the truck. Now, only Kate stayed behind. She had decided that a day at home without her two little brothers was going to be more fun for her than going to the cattle market. And so Frances had been given the job to weed the garden. He was outside. Kate assumed he was doing the work. As the morning went on, she was feeling a little bit badly about how she had spoken to him the day before, and it was a hot day, and she thought he'll probably really enjoy a glass of lemonade. So she got that ready, and she got some of the cookies that she and Mrs. Lenny had made the day before. She put them on a tray. She took him out there thinking he'll just really enjoy this break from this hard job. Maybe he'll even be done with weeding the garden by now. But when she walked out, she saw Frances had not even begun his work, and instead he was walking up from the river. Oh, Kate exploded. She yelled at him, "You are a lazy boy. You haven't even begun your work." "Well, I'll tell you what," she said, "there'll be no dinner for you until you have finished this job." Frances just sat down there on a barrel by the house. And he said, "I am not your slave. I only work when I want to. In fact, everybody around this place treats me like a slave. I am not anybody's slave. I won't even stay here unless I want to." Now Kate really lost her temper, and she began to yell at him. "I wish you wouldn't stay here. You are lazy, you are ungrateful, you're a liar, you're cruel. Don't you think we know about you throwing rocks at the ducks? Don't you think we know that those stories you've been telling the boys are just a pack of lies? Nobody wanted you here in the first place, and we all wish you would leave." And she stomped off. Frances could hardly breathe. All he kept hearing was, "Nobody wanted you here in the first place, and we all wish you'd leave." Was this true? Well, if it was, he decided, then he was leaving. But first, he was so angry inside. He was so hurt inside. He felt like he had to do something mean to somebody. And so, right there he was standing beside Mrs. Glennie's favorite flower garden. She was so proud of that flower garden. It was full of tulips. Right now they all were blooming. Red, yellow, orange, purple. They were beautiful. She was proud of it, and Frances knew that. And he walked over to a tree, and he broke off a long, skinny branch, and he walked over to the flower garden, and he took that stick, and he broke off every single flower in Mrs. Glennie's garden. He wrecked them all. Then he threw that stick down, he went and got his bike, he jumped on, he started pedaling as fast as he could down that bumpy trail and away from the farm. Just then Kate came out and she saw him, and she yelled after him, "Frances, no, wait, Frances, come back." But Frances kept right on going. Oh no, now what? You tune in for chapter 5 and you'll know all about it.